Okay, Reading Rainbow, episode 88, Seashore Surprises by Rose Weiger. Let's see what it says. Every trip to a beach is full of surprises. Strange shells, seaweeds, and shining pebbles. Where did they come from, you wonder? What animals lived in the shells? And why are the pebbles so smooth and round? What makes the waves? This book will help you find answers to your questions in the sand and water where the sea begins. Walk barefoot on beach sand. It feels soft and smooth, like velvet, yet sand grains are bits of hard stone. The grains once had sharp edges, but as waves tossed them about, they rubbed against rocks, pebbles, and each other. The rubbing made them smooth. Look at some sand grains with a magnifying glass and see how round they are. No wonder the sand feels so smooth when you walk on it. Pebbles, too, once had sharp edges. The pebbles came from chunks of stone that were rolled and tumbled by water. The tumbling wore them down. Bit by bit, their edges broke off, forming sand grains. The sand polished the stones, and in time, they became round and silky smooth. The sea is never still. Winds push against the water, and the pushing causes waves. While a wave moves forward, the water that it passes through stays in place. Watch a gull that's floating in the sea. The gull bobs up and down on a wave, yet it stays in the same place as the wave moves on. When a wave reaches shallow water, the lower part of it drags across the ocean floor. The top rolls ahead of the rest, topples over, and breaks into foam. Now the water in the wave moves forward. As it moves back, it may leave shells or other small things on the sand. If you swim in the ocean, you probably have tasted seawater. It's quite salty, isn't it? There's about 1/3 of a teaspoonful of salt in every cupful of seawater. The salt is dissolved, so you can't see it. Sea creatures need the salt in the water. Nearly all sea animals die in fresh water, but those along the sea's edge can live out of water for a few hours by closing up tight or hiding in damp places. Twice a day, high tide follows low tide. Watch the water rush into the shore, and you can tell which way the tide is going. As the tide rises, each lap of water moves in farther and the beach gets narrower. As the tide goes down, the beach gets wider. Low tide is the time for beachcombing. You will want a pail to collect things tossed ashore during high tide. You will want a shovel too, to dig up creatures in the sand. A magnifying glass will also come in handy. Hey, lots of shells and seaweed lie along the line, marking the tide's highest point. That's a good place to start exploring. Beach hoppers, also called beach fleas, hop among the seaweeds. Catch a few hoppers and examine them. Each has a flattened body, the color of sand. It walks on its 5 front pairs of legs and swims with the next 3 pairs. The last 3 pairs are legs for hopping. When the tide goes out, many creatures dig into the wet sand for safety. But you can find some of them. If you see a jet of water squirting out of the sand, dig there and you'll find a clam. After a clam buries itself, it sticks out a part of its body that looks like a long tube with 2 holes. Water-carrying waste squirts out of one hole. The other sucks in new water, carrying bits of food from the wet sand. All clams live between 2 shells that open and close. As they grow, new ridges form on the shells. Some kinds of clams become as wide as 8 inches. Others only get to be half an inch wide. One kind, the razor clam, has a shell that is long and narrow and brownish in color. When the clam digs into sand, it leaves a dent with 2 holes in it. Drop some salt into a dent, and perhaps a live razor clam will come out. Many people eat clams, so do many birds. Some kinds of snails are clam eaters too. Using their rough tongues, they bore round holes in the sand and scrape out the meat. That's why you find lots of clam shells with holes in them. The moon snail may eat as many as 3 or 4 clams a day. It moves across the sand on its strong foot, leaving behind a broad trail. If you find a trail, follow it, and maybe you'll find a moon snail. The whelk also drills holes in clams. Although bigger than the moon snail, the whelk eats just 1 clam a mouth. Its shell is very pretty, but whole ones are not very common. Sometimes egg cases with live whelks in them are cast on the beach. The cases are on a stream. Open a few hundreds of cases and hundreds of perfect tiny shells spill out. Well, let's give it a try. See, open a few hundreds of shells, and hundreds of perfect tiny shells will spill out. A snail moves slowly on a broad, flat foot, yet sometimes you see a surprising thing. A shell scooting along on thin, jointed legs. The legs belong to a crab. The hermit crab that has made its home in an empty snail shell. Its front legs are claws that the hermit crab uses to grab food. When a hermit crab grows too big for its home, it looks for a larger shell to move into. Marsh grass is the home of the fiddler crab. It is called a fiddler because the male has 1 front claw that's bigger than the other. This crab moves sideways. The mole crab or sand bug moves backwards through the sand. As it digs a hole, its feelers stick out, and so the crab can tell what is going on around it. One of the prettiest shells on the beach is the thin jingle shell. Some jingles are golden, some are silvery. Ah, jingle shell. It's like jingling coins. Okay, now where was I? Oh yeah! Like clams, they live between 2 shells, but they do not dig into the sand. Each has threads that go through a hole in the bottom shell and anchor on a rock. By the way, if you string some jingle shells with holes, you'll have a nice necklace. The shells of scallops are beautiful too. They are quite common on sandy beaches. But the live animals stay in the water between 2 shells. They see with tiny blue eyes that stick out between the rings of their shells. A scallop is a jerky swimmer. It opens and closes its shells, forcing out jets of water that drive it in the opposite direction. The animals have few enemies and may live 5 or 6 years. Did you ever eat scallops? If you did, you ate the mussels that open and close the shells. People eat oysters too. Oysters grow in clumps on flats called beds, where they can be seen at low tide. Their shells are gray or brown outside, and white and pearly inside. An oyster may lay 50 million eggs a year, but of that number only 5 or 6 grow up. Other sea animals eat the rest. Before you explore rocks along the shore, attach a string to a plastic carton and hang it around your neck. Then your hands will be free as you poke around the rocks. You'll also want to wear sneakers. Wet rocks are slippery. When the tide is going out, start at the high water mark and work toward the sea. Moving along, you go through different zones, each with different kinds of living things. Examine these creatures, then put them back on the rocks where they live. At the high tide mark, tiny black plants cover the rocks, and so this zone is called the black zone. A small snail-like animal, the periwinkle, lives here. It creeps along with its head out of its shell and eats by scraping tiny plants off the rocks with its long, rough tongue. In looking for food, it sometimes moves to the zone below, the barnacle zone. Full-grown barnacles stay fastened to rocks. Each one lives inside a white shell, with its head pointing downward. When the tide comes in, the shell opens and the barnacle's feathery feet wave and stir bits of food in the water toward its mouth. The barnacle zone is a great hunting ground. There you'll find the curved tops of sliver shells clinging to the rocks or to other shellfish. The name is a good one, for the inside of an empty shell looks like a tiny sliver. When alive, these animals are held down by suction, but waves often wash them ashore. If you turn over some stones, you'll find another clinging animal, the chitin. The chitin has 8 overlapping plates that form a ball when the animal is picked up. Pick one up and watch its shape change. Look for limpets too. These animals live under cone-shaped shells. As they scrape seaweed off rocks, they cut grooves that become looping trails. Each limpet makes a trail of its own. When the tide rises, water fills the grooves and the limpet wanders from its trail. When the tide falls, it comes back to eat bits of food left by the sea. Before the barnacles, you'll find mussels, perhaps thousands of them. Strong threads hold their dark blue shells to the rocks. When out of water, the shells are closed. But when the tide comes in, they open to take in water with bits of food. Little colored whelks, called winkles, prowl along the mussels. These animals drill holes in mussel shells with their rubbed tongues and then pull out the meat. Waved whelks get their food in the same way. They are somewhat larger than winkles and live near the low tide mark. The sea star is another enemy of the mussel, creeping along on tiny white tube feet. A sea star keeps one arm lifted. A red eye at the tip guides it. When it finds a mussel, it drapes its arms around the prey and pulls on it until the mussel gets tired and opens its shells. Then the sea star pushes out its stomach and eats the helpless mussel. Sometimes sea stars hide under rockweed. At low tide, rockweed lies flat, forming a slippery brown mat. But when they are covered by water, the rockweed plants float and wave around. Some kinds have air bladders that help them stand up. Below the rockweed, you may find red seaweeds and farther down, big brown kelp. Both are underwater most of the time. but pieces of them sometimes break off and wash ashore. As you get near the low tide line, look for pools among the rocks. These tide pools are underwater gardens with draperies of seaweed on their walls. More kinds of animals live in them than in any other part of the shore. Some of the animals look like plants. Bristly sea urchins look like little bushes. Anemones have tentacles that look like flower petals, and velvety green sponges seem to be mats of moss. Poke around the seaweed, and you'll see sea stars gliding over them. You'll find periwinkles with covered shells creeping around, and you can watch tiny fish and shrimp swimming in the clear water. When the tide starts coming in, it's time to head for dry ground. All the wonders of the tide pool will soon be hidden by the sea. Low tide, high tide, and low tide again. Lucky you to be there, exploring and finding shells, live animals and plants, and so many wonderful surprises at the edge of the sea.
Bye, Super Readers! I'll see you next time.
The end.